Apapun yang kau perbuat, perbuatlah dengan segenap hatimu, seperti untuk Tuhan dan bukan untuk manusia. Kerjakan dengan setia apapun yang ia percayakan, mahkota kehidupan ia janjikan, ia janjikan, ia janjikan bagimu.
In this lecture, we're going to pick up where we left off with the Byzantine world in our last lecture. And in our last lecture, we discussed the fall of the Western Roman half of the empire. And then we picked up the story of the Byzantine world, or the Byzantine Empire, and we carried it forward until just prior to the fall of the Western Empire in 476. And in this lecture, we're going to pick up the second half of that story, looking at the Byzantine world shortly after the fall of the Western Roman Empire and carrying it forward into about the middle of the 800s. And we begin by looking at one of the greatest Byzantine rulers ever, and that was Justinian. Now, Justinian has had a wide effect on all history, both in the West and in the East, and that is because he is really sort of a paragon of a ruler. The things that he does, the idiosyncrasies of his rule, and the number of legislations that he enacted had wide-ranging effects on the world throughout both the East and the West. And Justinian is really a bit of an interesting fellow. We know, for example, that he hardly slept and ate. He had a number of enemies, both in the court and outside of it. In one case, one of the biographers of Justinian during his reign actually wrote two biographies, one to tell the sort of cleaned up account of Justinian, and then one that told of all the skeletons in the closet, some real and some imagined. And there are lots of things that sort of tell of Justinian being a strange man. For one, he married Theodora. And Theodora was a powerful queen. In one case, she actually saves Justinian from giving up the throne during a revolt in the city of Constantinople. But Theodora was actually from a brothel. She had been a courtesan. And despite her dicey past, Justinian fell in love with her, and he decided to make her his queen. And there were all kinds of rumors and whispers about this throughout Justinian's reign and long after. But putting aside the gossip and the intrigues in and around the court with Justinian's personality, when we look at just his reign, we see that there's an interesting mixture of pretty good legislation and success and some calamitous setbacks during Justinian's reign that would have monumental significance for the development of the Byzantine Empire. First and foremost, Justinian supported a more rigorous persecution and suppression of paganism throughout the Eastern world. It is Justinian, for example, who in Athens actually closed once and for all the school of Plato. And this is a school of philosophy begun by Plato himself that had been in session for centuries. And Justinian found that it was not a good thing to have a bastion of Neoplatonic and Platonic philosophy spreading paganism and pagan philosophy throughout the empire, and so he put an end to it. More strategically, he continued the practice of outlawing pagan sacrifices, and he tried to curtail certain forms of paganism. He doesn't try to persecute it in one's private life, but he does put an end to paganism in any form that is public. Justinian also supported a number of positive things, positive developments, both economically and legally within his empire. He supported significant building campaigns of churches. He actually had silkworms from China stolen and brought back to the east, to Asia Minor, so that an economic boom could happen with the sale and the production of silk there in and around Constantinople. And he also supported and drove some of the most significant legislation and legal reform ever in the history of the Roman world, which we'll talk about more in just a minute. Well, all of this could have come to an end very quickly in 532 with the riots of Nika. And this is one of the more well-known stories about Justinian. But in this day and age, the sport of the commoner, the sport of every person in and around the Eastern world, was chariot racing, sort of like the NFL is today in much of at least the American world. And I'm sure soccer or European football is the equivalent for much of the rest of the world. Well, in Constantinople, the stadium for chariot racing was actually right next to the palatial mansion of the emperor himself. And it was very common that the chariot colors, the chariot teams, would be broken up into different colors. And at the time of Justinian's reign, the two most dominant forces, the two most dominant fan bases, were the greens and the blues. And before you start to think this is only a sporting issue, an issue of sort of sports hooliganism, really what happened is the chariot teams, the hooligans that sort of supported the greens and the blues at this time, also did see themselves as a bit of a union or a bit of a political movement. They would be supported by some of the nobility with funds, and at times, during certain of the more popular races, when two of the more important greens or blues would be out there racing, very often the amphitheater would churn into a political arena. And just as soon as one side was yelling for the greens and one side was yelling for the blues, at the end of a race or in the interim period, you would often have a series of political shouts and these kinds of very public displays of opinions by the masses. Well, at this time, Justinian had a bit of an issue on his hand because two of the most successful charioteers for both the greens and the blues had come under fire for some real serious crimes. And it was determined that they would both be put to death. Again, you'd almost have to see this as just in the run-up to the Super Bowl, the two starting quarterbacks being caught in some illegal action and being put to death, or at least being tried and decreed that they would be put to death. Well, at this time, the Greens and the Blues decided that they were going to join up, at least in terms of their anger over this decision to have the two leading charioteers for both sides executed. And they came to the amphitheater and they began to yell on the one side for the Greens, on the other side for the Blues, and eventually it spilled over into a riot. Justinian was not willing to listen to mob rule. He was going to impose order, and so as a result, he did not listen to their demands to set the charioteers free, and they rioted. Hagia Sophia itself, the original establishment of the Constantinian Church, burned to the ground. And at one point, Justinian and Theodora and the royal court were actually pinned up in the palace. And the rioters had besieged the palace, and it seemed as if Justinian was going to throw in the towel. Justinian decided that he was going to give up, that he was going to flee, and that whoever was appointed to be emperor next could just very well have it if this is all he was going to have to put up with. And it's at this point that Theodora stepped forward and chastened Justinian, told him to be an emperor, put an end to the rule. Do not listen to the Greens and the Blues. Do not listen to their demands. And because they have rioted, he needed to act with swift vengeance and put them down. And she had an effect on Justinian. And as a result, he put to an end the Nika revolt, which very nearly brought an end to his empire before it even began. And Justinian was in many ways galvanized by this for the rest of his rule. No longer was he going to be pushed around. He was now going to be a serious emperor and one of serious martial ethos. And so, now that the West had fallen, and now that Justinian had been steeled by the words of Theodora and the Nika revolt, Justinian set about to reconquer the West. Now, the story I'm about to tell is a bit of a mystery for at least intro students to the study of history, because very often in textbooks, they'll come across a little bit of a statement that the Byzantine world had come and they had conquered parts of North Africa and Italy. And I've had a number of questions from students over the years where they ask, is this not something of an onslaught? Is this not problematic? Why is the Byzantine world attacking the West? These kinds of things. But again, if you take a step back and you remember that the Roman world was both East and West, and that from the perspective of the Byzantine side of the eastern half of the empire, the fall of the Western Roman Empire is a loss. They believe that, in essence, half of the Roman Empire is now under siege by pagans. And so what Justinian is attempting to do is to free, at least in his own mind, to free the Western Roman Empire so that it can return to the Roman Empire as a whole. And the general that is tasked with doing this is Belisarius. And there's a lot that could be said about Belisarius. He is a wonderful general. He is a superior tactician. In many ways, if it were not for the fact that he was on the losing side of much of what he was attempting to do, he might very well have gone down as one of the most superior generals of the ancient world, or at least of the late ancient Roman world. And what happens is Belisarius is sent by Justinian to reconquer as much of the West as is possible. And so what Justinian and Belisarius do is they negotiate a deal with the Lombards. And the Lombards are a group of pagans that had taken a significant chunk of the Italian peninsula and on down into Sicily and into parts of North Africa. And Belisarius negotiates that the Lombards, through a payment, through a bribe, would leave the island of Sicily for the Byzantine world to establish as a home base. And that is exactly what happens. Belisarius lands on the island of Sicily, and from there he launches a series of campaigns to reconquer from the Lombards and from others areas that had been formerly part of the Roman Western Empire. He eventually takes parts of North Africa around the area of Carthage, and he pushes up into south and into the middle part of the Italian peninsula. And so, for a very significant period of time, all the way down until 1071, in fact, the Byzantine world will actually control on and off again parts of the southern Italian and Sicilian worlds. This will officially, again, on and off again, be seen by the Byzantines as part of their lands for centuries. However, it's at this point, just as the Byzantine world is beginning to launch these campaigns to reconquer parts of the West, that the old nemesis of the Roman world, the Persians, rose up. And in fact, in 540, the Persians, sensing that the Byzantines were distracted with their campaigns in the West, they mounted an army and they took significant parts of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. They took modern-day areas like Syria, Palestine, areas around Jerusalem, Antioch, and significant regions in and around these areas that were part of the Eastern Roman Empire. And so Justinian is forced to call Belisarius and the armies back, just as they are on the verge of at least pushing through to the Italian peninsula and maybe on into the Frankish regions around the Alps. The Byzantine world has to take their successes, the few that they've had, and count them as enough because they had to come back to defend themselves against the Persian armies. But another calamitous event was coming on Justinian and the Byzantine world. In 542 and 543, there came to the Byzantine world what is likely the first outbreak of the bubonic plague. Today we know this as the Justinian plagues. 1542, 1543, suddenly a plague descends upon the Byzantine world and spreads like wildfire. As much as a third of the population dies over a period of a short number of years. Now, no matter how great or how strong an empire might be, they could not suffer such a calamitous event, such a breakdown of the population as the bubonic plague brought to the Byzantine world without any significant loss in power or value or might. And so Justinian and the armies under Belisarius have always been sort of a big question mark for historians. What might have happened had the bubonic plague not come to the Justinian Byzantine world? Or what might have happened if the Persians had laid dormant while Belisarius was attempting to take back the Western Roman Empire? And these are questions we'll never know, but they are certainly ones that have a turning point for the Byzantine world, because from this point on, from the Justinian plague on, the Byzantine world will have to sort of turtle up. It'll have to hunker down No more will it have the power or the grandeur or the might, at least not for a significant period of time, to ever really consider attempting to conquer the western half of the empire. And by the time they might have considered reconquering parts of the Western Roman Empire, there has already arisen a Western Roman Empire in the person of Charlemagne. And we'll have a lecture on the rise of Charlemagne and the renewed Western Empire a little bit later. Now, the last thing we want to say about Justinian is we want to look at the legislation and the legal reform that happened during Justinian's reign and some of the other sort of glorious things that Justinian did that have a legacy for both the east and the western half of the late Roman Empire. We've already mentioned that Justinian was a powerful advocate and a supporter of church buildings and of the development of the eastern grandeur of the churches and of the establishment of the church in the Roman Empire. And as we've already mentioned, during the Nika Revolt, the original Hagia Sophia burned to the ground. Well, in just a short period of time, Justinian had designed a brand new Hagia Sophia. And this one would outdo just about any church in the world all the way down until today. Hagia Sophia was rebuilt during Justinian's reign, and not surprisingly, it is said that during the dedication of the church, Justinian, standing in front of the new Hagia Sophia, is said to have remarked, "Solomon, I have outdone thee." And this new Hagia Sophia is the one, by and large, that is still standing today. It is a massive domed building. The dome itself is something like 165 feet off the ground. It is really an architectural wonder. Why the thing hasn't repeatedly fallen in is really a bit of a mystery. It has fallen on a few occasions. It fell very shortly in 558 during an earthquake, and much of the design of Hagia Sophia had to be reimagined. The walls had to be reinforced, and the dome had to be sort of carved out in a way that took some of the weight off of the dome itself. And a significant portion of it again fell 2 times later over the course of its history. And there are lots of reasons for this that go back to sort of how the concrete was mixed, how the bricks were put down for the first time. But needless to say, if you look at modern Hagia Sophia, most of what you're seeing is the Justinian church that was built. Of course, what has been added since are the minarets, the long sort of pointy towers that were added by the Islamic world after they conquered Constantinople and renamed it Istanbul. Hagia Sophia was turned then into a mosque. Today, Hagia Sophia and the mosque itself are essentially a museum for those who visit Istanbul to see this church. But churches aside, the most important thing Justinian did was he reformed the legal code. Now, Roman law was something to be marveled at. It was very impressive. However, over the course of centuries, so many laws have been added, and some to the point of even being a bit contradictory. But so many laws were added, and so many laws were not written down in a very clear and cogent way, that this led Justinian to the decision to reform the legal code. And that legal code was eventually written down in a number of books that have gone down in history as some of the most important changes to legislation to affect not just the Western world, but the Near Eastern world as well. There was the Justinian Law Code, followed up by the Digest, and the Institutes, and a number of others. And what Justinian did is he pared down all the repetitive language and all of the seemingly incoherent laws, and even some of the laws that were contradictory. And having published this, he then distributed it throughout the, at least still, Roman world of the East. And so impactful was the Justinian reform of the law that it eventually came home to roost even in the West, even despite the fact that the Western world had ceased to be part of the Roman world, at least in the united sense with East and West. And so, as many historians have claimed and noted, the Justinian law effort is really one major step in the development of the modern concept of law, of clear laws written down so that they might be applied fairly and in a simple way in all situations involving citizens of the empire. Now, moving ahead from Justinian to look at some of the later developments in the Byzantine world, one of the most important crises in the Eastern Church was the crisis over iconoclasm. Now, iconoclasm is a theological position in which the The person believes that any art used for the purpose of worship is inherently sinful. More specifically, iconoclasm tends to focus on images of Christ, or in some cases, images of the Trinity as a whole. But it's really more of a general position against those who would use art for the sake of worship. And in the 8th century of the Byzantine world, there arose an iconoclastic controversy that sought to remove images and the use of art in the church entirely. And the issue really seems to have sprung up almost out of nowhere. The Byzantine emperor at the time was Leo III. Now, immediately we have to point out something here. There are two Leo IIIs about the same time. There is the Emperor Leo III, who rules in the early 700s, and then a little bit later there is Pope Leo III. Now, you have to get this in your mind. These are not the same guy. Two different Leo IIIs living and ruling about the same time. One in the east is the Byzantine Emperor, and the other is Pope. Well, the Leo III we're talking about now is the Byzantine Emperor. And in 726, this Leo III decided that he was going to issue an edict pulling down all of the images of Christ, of Mary, and of the other saints that sat upon the chalk gate of the palace there in Constantinople. And this action sparked the iconoclastic controversy, the first of two in the Byzantine world. Leo argued that these images were an assault on Christ's dignity, that they were theologically invalid, and that therefore being sinful, that they exposed the Byzantine world to the jeopardy of the censure of God. And historians have looked behind this, and they've attempted to find the origins of this debate. And really they're elusive. We're not quite sure what provoked Leo to do this. There were not a lot of rumblings to this effect for some time before. The most we can say is that after the rule of Justinian, and in particular going back a little bit further into the reign of Constantine, there had arisen almost a proliferation of the use of images in worship. The little we do know about the use of art in the first several centuries of the church shows that the church was okay with art in general. We see lots of art on the catacombs and in the sarcophagi for the earliest centuries of the church. We don't see a lot of representations of Christ, however. Usually Christ is depicted through some sort of symbol, something like the ichthus or some other type of symbol in general. We do, however, have occasions where we do see Christ depicted in art. But for several centuries in the early church, this is really not a theological issue, so we don't have a lot of evidence as to how most of the early church fathers might have viewed the use of art, particularly in the relationship to the depiction of Christ. There is virtually no evidence that anyone in the early church used art or images in some kind of worship setting. That is to say, we don't see candles lit before these images or bowing before them. The earliest evidence we have of these things beginning in the early church is around the 6th century. You see votive candles being lit before certain saints. And you begin to see evidence that people during their prayers are bowing to the images and to the icons. At some point around this time, then, you see a transition in the early form of worship to a more involved relationship with icons and images. At some point, as one historian has argued, the difference between the image and the thing being worshipped through the image or depicted in the image began to become very thin, sometimes bleeding together. And what happens is you see the icons and the images moving from being something that depicts Christ or depicts, maybe in a pedagogical sense, the story of the Gospels. And you begin to see some of these images and these icons becoming somewhat talismanic, something almost magical in some cases. That these icons and images begin to have a power almost in and of themselves. There's also some evidence that what Leo is worried about is that there is a divide, really, between the devotion of the monks in the East to icons and images, and to a split within the church where the clergy and the bishops themselves are not quite as dependent, or really in some cases don't use images and icons very much at all. It's one thing to have art in the church, it's another thing to use them purposely as part of your worship. Whatever the case, in 726, Leo declared that images were to be removed. And as you can imagine, he experienced some opposition. One of the main theological oppositions that was mounted against this was by a monk by the name of St. John of Damascus. And St. John of Damascus argued pretty forcefully that the denial and the destruction of icons and images on theological grounds was tantamount to denying Christ's incarnation itself. And so St. John of Damascus gives us one of the enduring arguments for the use of icons and images in the church, both in the East and in the West. This occurs pretty often, this idea that because Christ himself, being divine, became incarnate and took on human flesh, therefore an icon is kind of governed by similar rules. That is to say, even though you're depicting Christ's human nature, that because Christ is incarnate, you are not breaking the second commandment. Now, there were theological responses to this as well, but we don't have to go into all of those at this time. What is important to note is that iconoclasm ravaged the early Byzantine church as a result of Leo III's actions. And though Leo himself was quite moderate with the monks, his successors began to attack the monasteries and those who were dependent and who incorporated icons and images into their worship aggressively. Constantine V and his successor Constantine VI were both pretty vehement about their attack on the monasteries. And all of the swirling confusion in the debate that went on during this eventually gave rise to the seventh and the final ecumenical council in 787, often referred to as Nicaea II, because it occurred in Nicaea.
Planning to take an English proficiency test to study abroad? Join millions of students across the world who have already taken the Duolingo English test. Now recognized by over 5,000 plus institutions, the DET can be taken at any time, anywhere, and it costs just 1/3 of the...
And the Seventh Ecumenical Council is not as widely studied as the others, but you might say that the Seventh Ecumenical Council was an application of the Christology of the earlier churches to this issue. Now, a lot of Protestants later will take issue with the decision of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, but nonetheless, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, Nicaea II, issues the definitive differentiation between how an image is to be used for prayer or worship and how it is not to be used for prayer and worship. And the argument that they use essentially rests on two main points. On the first hand, Nicaea II argues that iconoclasm, harsh iconoclasm, is Jewish or Manichaean. Now, there are some issues here, of course. To equate Judaism and Manichaeanism is a bit of a strange mix. And there is lurking here some general anti-Semitism. This idea that to apply the Ten Commandments in a specific way to the use of icons and images as being somehow Jewish is a bit of a weak argument. Nonetheless, this is what they do. They say that to deny images and icons is to rely too much on non-Christian sources, which, again, they're pointing there to the Manichaeans. Nicaea II then makes an argument in which they say that to venerate an image or an icon is not the same as worshiping it. And so they make the argument that one can give honor, that one can use an image or an icon to perform a certain element of worship, that the icon or image somehow draws the person in, the believer in, to the worship of the one true God, though it itself is not being worshipped. And so at this point, Nicaea II distinguishes between worshiping and venerating. And that is an incredibly important distinction because it will live on down until the Protestant Reformation. And in Eastern Orthodox and in Catholic churches, it is still the modus operandi when they approach the use of art or icons or images and these kinds of things. And that is, they argue that they are not worshiping these things when they bow to them or kiss them, that they are simply performing the proper veneration owed to these things, and that worship alone is reserved, therefore, for God. And iconoclasm will have a number of important effects. In the first place, iconoclasm does get stamped out in the East. Eventually, the Eastern position will be to allow a certain amount of veneration of icons and images in its worship. Now, it's going to be more restrained than the development of worship and veneration in the Western Church, in what would become the Catholic Church. But still, the Eastern Church maintains its distinction between veneration and worship. The most important thing about this, however, is just the timing of it. Because as the iconoclastic controversy is going on, the Western Church really looks at the Eastern Church scratching its head. The West, in particular the Pope, cannot understand why the Eastern Church is suddenly becoming iconoclastic for a period of time. And just as this is boiling, and just as this is beginning to bubble over in the East, the West is beginning to feel very, very vulnerable. And so notice the date, 787. This is just a number of years before Charlemagne is coronated by the papacy and announced once and for all to be the Western Roman Emperor. And all during these years, during the iconoclastic controversy, really the struggles in the East to maintain a proper understanding of worship and veneration, which the West seems to have had no qualms about, actually in some ways propels the papacy and propels the Western Church into the Frankish and Merovingian arms. They need to have some protectors. They need to make sure that they have stability in the Western Empire, and as a result, they go looking for a new emperor of the West. And we'll pick up those lectures in a bit on the Merovingians and the Carolingian dynasties. But notice the effect. The East gets stirred up on the issue of iconoclasm, and as a result, it seems to drive a little bit of a wedge, if not a very big wedge, between the East and the West, and the Western Church and the papacy go on their own, looking for another emperor that could protect them. And the last thing we want to say about the Byzantine world, as we sort of push on into the Middle Ages, is we want to say something about Cyril and Methodius.
I really feel like studying at Goldsmiths has helped my future. Just before I started the course, I was in a
Cyril and Methodius were both monks and both missionaries living in the 9th century. And they were commissioned at one point by the Byzantine emperor to go into the Slavic regions of what we now would call the Eastern Bloc of Europe. And they went and they ministered and they learned the language of the Slavic peoples. And, importantly, they decided that they needed to translate the scriptures into the Slavic tongue. And as a result, the two of them devised a number of alphabets, but the most important of which is the Cyrillic alphabet. And this alphabet was used as the backbone to developing some of the Old Slavic language. It also meant that once Cyril and Methodius had translated the Bible into the Slavic language, there was now a natural bond between the Byzantine world and the Slavic peoples. And not only that, but as the Slavic peoples began to mingle and as they came in contact with the Rus, that is to say the Proto-Russian peoples up into the north, very, very soon the Slavic peoples and the Russians begin to intermingle, and the Byzantine world, through the work of Cyril and Methodius, begin to make inroads into the Russian world. And very, very shortly, by the year 1000, Queen Olga, the queen of the Russians, converts to the Eastern Orthodox faith. And therefore, the Cyrillic alphabet eventually becomes the backbone of the modern Russian language. And not only that, but it is for this reason, as the Byzantine world expands and as it moves up into the northern parts of its own empires, and as it has contact with the Rus, it is for that reason that all the way down until today, there is a Russian Orthodox Church, there is an Old Slavic Orthodox Church, and there are all these connections between the Byzantine world on up into the Russian part of the Northern Hemisphere.